All right. So maps and Metabase, I feel like, are a little bit of an obscure feature. So I'm going to spend a little more time than usual just going over the basics of maps. Then I'm going to show you how to create custom maps in Metabase. I'm going to actually show you what I've done a couple of weeks ago myself for my own interests. And then we're going to discuss some best practices about using maps, how to decide which map to use, and depending on what you want to communicate. If we have some time, we'll also talk a little bit about how Metabase decides how to map your data on your own. All right, so let me start by creating a question. Let's say accounts. I'm going to look at this table. It's just, it's the table in our sample database. We're going to work with real data a little bit later. But for now, here's a table, just a bunch of accounts with fields like latitude, longitude, and country, right? So these are the type of fields that we're going to be using in this webinar. I can visualize them on a map. I can pick visualization here. And if I don't do anything else, so I started with this just table of people with some coordinates and country, Metabase will create what we call a pin map for this. So pin map is literally just putting every single one, or almost every single one of the data points on a map. I'm saying almost single one because imagine if you have like many thousands of data points, you probably don't want to put like every single one, but Metabase just selects in a smart way which points to put. So this is a way to represent non-summarized data. And I can do stuff like filter and zoom in and see the actual individual pin maps. And if I hover over them, I'll see the data points, right? So this is the most basic map visualization. It's also the one that I see people misuse the most often, and maybe we'll talk about this later. But what you have to keep in mind is that Metabase is not a GIS. It's not a geoinformation system, right? It's not intended for just like display of fine-grained individual data points on a map. Think about when you do your dashboards in Metabase, you do stuff like pie charts and bar charts. It's summaries for metrics. So you're not really displaying each individual data points. You want to display some kind of summarized metric. And maps in Metabase allow you to do it in two different ways. So the first way is to just summarize I'm using count, but it can be any summary by coordinates. So I have these latitude and longitude coordinates, and I can just summarize by latitude and longitude, and Metabase will create what we call a grid map automatically. Let me go to the settings. There we go. A grid map, which is basically like, imagine a histogram, right? But it's like a two-dimensional histogram over a map. And there are some controls you have here. You can say, I actually want very fine-grained. So like I want my histogram over the map to be bent with like 1 degree, and then you get this chart. And you can do the same thing as before. So zoom in. You can also do this where you click on a particular data point and just zoom in latitude and zoom in longitude and see the heat map for individual regions. So this is kind of closer to what Metabase is for, right? To displaying aggregated data. And this is good for when the only thing that you have is just coordinates. But the really the best way to display geographical data in Metabase is what we call a region map. So it's closer to kind of how you use any other kind of data in Metabase, right? Because what you do, maybe you like filter it, let's say by, I don't know, created at last 12 months. If you were building like a bar chart, you would filter it and maybe count by some sort of category. And I can do the same thing, but instead of binning by, say, latitude and longitude, I can just count by country and create this wonderful map. So this is my favorite type of visualization in Metabase because, well, first of all, I think it's the prettiest, but also I think it kind of communicates the summary information in the best way possible, right? So we have this color saturation is indicating the strength of the metric, and when there are no data, we have these. I woke up at like 5 a.m. today, so I'm having trouble with words. When there is no data, you have the gray regions and so on, right? So this is a nice map to display summary information. So in a little while, in like maybe 20 minutes, I'm actually going to give you my most spicy opinion is that you should always try to use region maps if you want to use a map in the first place. But region maps are also give you a little more of kind of interactive capability. For example, you can click on this and then zoom in and you'll get the grid map. And then you can go and zoom in into the particular grid by latitude and longitude if you wanted to. And then you can go and actually see these records in any particular bin. Right? So it's also a more interactive way to display your data. Now, all of these, why did I go back here? All of these work, so these are 3 different map types, right? And they all work with different data. And kind of deciding on which data, which type you're going to use is going to be determined as much by the data that you have as it will be by what you're trying to communicate. So let me review quickly what I just said, but with a focus on data. The pin map, where you literally put every individual data points, it requires unaggregated data, right? It requires you to have coordinates for every data point, and then it will create a pin for each point, right? If you want to do a grid map, so a kind of heat map or histogram over the map, even if I try to do this here, Metabase will get very confused and tell me that it requires binned latitude, longitude. So I need a data that's in this form where I have latitude and longitude bins. 1 second. There we go. So data that looks like this. And if I want a region map, I need to have the data about actual regions. So data that looks like this. Now, why am I saying this, right? I'm saying this partially because Metabase is pretty smart. If you set your data types correctly, it will propose a chart for you. But if you're, for example, using your own data without proper metadata, or you're using SQL, you need to understand which shape Metabase expects of data for every chart, right? So if you want to build a region chart, you need to have information about the region. It's important that even though this data has latitude and longitude information in it, when I'm building the region chart, I'm not actually using this information. I'm only using information from the country column here, not any information about geographic coordinates, right? So whenever you want to build a chart that looks like one of these, each of them requires different shape of data, and each of them has different interactivity. Now, region map is interesting because Metabase has actually 2 types of them. You already seen one of them, which was the actual region. there we go, the regions of the world. But you can also build, for example, we have a sample people table. You can also you build it on the US map, like this. So whenever you have a data about countries, and it can be a country code or a country name, or data about US states, like here, a state abbreviation or a state name, Metabase will build a map automatically for you. But I already saw, even before I started talking, that some people were like, well, I want to build a map of Europe. I want to build a map of Sweden. And you can do that. They are not built into Metabase. Imagine like all possibilities of any maps that anyone could ever invent. We could not include all of them in Metabase, so we just included the most common one. But you absolutely can build your own maps that look pretty like this, but on a different region. And that's using custom maps. So I'm going to show it to you on an example that I actually built for myself a couple weeks ago. So I live in Brooklyn in New York City, and I bike everywhere. So it's important for me to know where I can actually park my bike when I go somewhere. So I went to NYC Open Data. Our city government provides us with a ton of data sets for free on this website. And I searched for stuff like, bicycle parking. And I found this data set for bicycle parking. It has a map, wonderfully, but I don't want to like look at just this not very pretty map. I want to put it into Metabase. So I looked at this data set. It has some coordinates information, latitude and longitude. So I downloaded it as a CSV, and I uploaded this in Metabase. By the way, if you didn't know about this, Metabase does let you upload CSVs. You just go into a collection and click on this upload data and just upload a CSV file. So I just downloaded this data set of bicycle parking, and I uploaded this to Metabase. And here's the same data set, right? And just from starting from here, without doing anything else, I can already do some mapping, right? I have these latitude and longitude columns. So I can create a map visualization, and I see the all the bicycle parking spots in the city. And this is kind of, this is pretty helpful, pretty okay for me. I can see, well, there are some like deserts here in Bed-Stuy. Most of Queens doesn't have any bicycle parking. In the slower Manhattan, it's really like, this is not very useful for me if I want to look at the data in aggregate. This is useful if I want to like identify if there is a parking spot for me on the intersection of like Flatbush and Atlantic or something, right? But it's not very useful for me to know what is the parking situation in general in some neighborhood that I'm going to go to. What I would want to say is, what I was want to do is like, look at this map in aggregate. And I can do that with a grid map like I showed you. So that's what I tried to do next. I did a count by latitude and longitude. And I got a super unhelpful map that looks like this. And that's because I selected auto binning. So I changed the binning to be a 1/10 of a degree. And this was still not very helpful, right? I'm looking at a very granular data by neighborhoods, by parts of the city. And this is not showing me much. So I'm going to show you basically a hack of Metabase interface. If you noticed in the editor, I can't actually bin for less than 0.1 degrees, but that's really an interface of this interface. It's not like an inherent limitation of Metabase. Metabase can actually bin finer than this. So what I can do, let me click on here, and I'm going to zoom in by latitude, and maybe I'm going to zoom in even further. And if you look at the filter up top here, you see that it changed from 0.1 to 0.01. And I can do the same thing for longitude, zoom in and have my longitude change. Have it changed yet? No, there we go. Zoom in further. There we go. And then I can just like remove the filters that I don't want, and maybe do like very broad filtering. All right, so what did I do? I started by creating a grid map through going through here, but it doesn't allow me to bin finer than 0.1. That's just a limitation of an interface that we're going to resolve eventually. But you can actually do this by zooming in continuously on the map. Metabase will switch to smaller bins. So if you ever wanted to do some kind of grid map on a city, you can just do this. However, for me, this also isn't really helpful. Like, yes, I now have these finer bins, but it's really giving me almost exactly the same information as pins. Like, okay, yes, I see that my bicycle parking is generally along the streets and not in the middle of a building. Like you see here, these straight lines, like, great. That's not really too helpful to me in the sense of, you know, knowing where to go and what is the situation going to be there. So I want to look at this data kind of in aggregate, but in a way that makes sense for how I think about the city rather than these arbitrary bins. So let me look back and at my data. For example, I see that it has a lot of information, right? In addition to coordinates, it has, well, it has addresses, it has the borough, it has the council district, like assembly district, it has neighborhoods. So all of this information I can use to organize the data into a map. For example, maybe I want to see how these how the bicycle parking situation varies along the borough. So what's the difference between Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens? If I just summarize by this borough, not borough code, wrong field, borough name, there we go. I will get, well, nothing. I can make it a bar chart, but I want to actually see this information on a map. Unfortunately, Metabase doesn't have a built-in map that shows me where Brooklyn is and where Manhattan is, right? But I can find this map. I can find it on the same website, but I can also just like Google search. So I can search something like borough boundaries, right? It will show me boundaries of each part of New York City. And I can export this. And what I will want to use is this GeoJSON. It gives me a lot of formats. It gives like CSVs, but Metabase wants GeoJSON format. And I'm going to just copy the link temporarily. So in my Metabase, I'm going to go to admin settings. Let me discard my changes. Maps. And there is in admin settings and maps, there is this field called custom maps. And I'm going to add a map. And all I need is to just paste this GeoJSON file that I found on a random website, and I'll get map of regions. And I'm going to call it NYC boroughs. I need to select these fields. What is the region identifier and what is the region display name? The difference between identifier and display name is, for example, for a country, you can have a country code and a country name. So a country code can be the identifier that's in your data, and the country name can be what you actually show on a map. But for my map, it's all, I'm just going to use the name of the borough for both of these. So I'm just going to add this map, close it, and go back to my data. I don't want to filter. I'm going to summarize by borough name again. Metabase gives me a bar chart because it doesn't know that it's a map yet. But I can switch to the map. And now I have this region map select a region option, and it has NYC boroughs. And it actually automatically picked up the column because it's the same name, but also because it's the only one I have in the summary. So it automatically picked the column that I grouped by. You might have to also pick this yourself, but this is the map that I just added in my custom maps, and it just shows me NYC boroughs. This is actually interesting data because you see this Brooklyn is actually much darker than, for example, Queens, but they have about the same amount of population. So this is interesting, right? That we have a lot more bicycle parking in Brooklyn than in Queens, even though the same amount of people live in both boroughs. So this is already pretty cool. I might want to look at this data in even more granular detail. So instead of looking at just a big chunk of borough, I might say, well, what about the neighborhoods? What about when I go to see my friend in Astoria? What's the situation there? So I go to NYC Open Data and I search for like neighborhoods. There we go. Can you tell that I already practiced this webinar? All right, so I also find a map for, oh, this is not actually the one. This is the one I used. I found the map for just boundaries of neighborhoods. And I could also export it as a GeoJSON, but this one particularly only allows me to download the file. It's a bit of a limitation that Metabase actually asks you to give a URL for a file instead of upload the file. So I upload it as a gist on GitHub. We'll look at this file in a second. For now, I just want to show you how it works. So I just like download this GeoJSON file, upload it on GitHub. So now I have this link, and I go back and add another map, admin settings, maps. There we go, my pretty map of neighborhoods. And here I'm just going to use the neighborhood name as both display name as identifier. And now I just summarize my bike parking data set by neighborhood name. There it is. Again, I need to tell Metabase that this is actually a geographical information, and select NYC neighborhoods map. And there we go. We see that there's a vast amount of difference between neighborhoods like Williamsburg, where all the cool people live. Not me, I live over here. And like Queens, where there are a lot of single family housing, a lot of people with children and families and so on, right? And this is also, first of all, it's like visually more appealing map. It corresponds to how people generally think about divisions. They don't think about places in New York as just like a latitude longitude grid, right? There is semantic meaning to these places, and like it just provides more actionable results. Because, for example, if I'm working for the city government and I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh, actually now I know exactly which person on like city council I need to bother to build more bike racks. It's going to be the person responsible for like this district, for example. It's a lot, it's better for presenting information. So it's very easy to upload custom maps. How you make them, right, is a different question. Let's look at what I just showed you. This was the file that I downloaded from NYC Open Data and upload it as a gist and put the map into Metabase. It's really just a JSON file. It's called GeoJSON for a reason. It's just like it has the name of the neighborhood, like Greenpoint, and then it is a polygon with some coordinates. Some wonderful person at NYC Data already did this for me. There are a lot of tools where you can do it yourself. We actually list some in our documents and documentation, but you almost certainly will not have to, because anything you can think of, probably someone already made a file like this for your division. You can search, for example, like, there we go. I searched for Canada provinces GeoJSON, and I found one immediately, right? And I can take this raw file and upload it to Metabase and get a map that looks like this. If you want, like, India states, you can find a GeoJSON that represents this. If you want just the EU map, you can find a GeoJSON that represents that by just like Googling it. That's pretty much how I found the neighborhood ones. But then I realized it's easier to just stay on the website, right? So there are ways you can draw these yourself, but you almost certainly never have to. Just like whatever, like US counties, US zip codes, I don't know, municipal divisions, all of this is already somewhere on the internet. Someone already made a thing like this. Another thing to say about this is it's actually a lot more flexible than you think. For example, if I don't know how many of you attend our webinars regularly, but our data scientist, Thomas, made this cool Euro dashboard and had a webinar recently on it. And there is this, let's see. He made a wonderful representation of like a football game in this by literally drawing a football field. Do you know what this is? This is just a file like this, right? It's not, Metabase doesn't care whether you actually put like boroughs or counties or countries in there. You can put anything. You can draw little cats on your map and name them cats, or you can draw a football field and have like broken into these rectangular regions. It's actually an extremely flexible tool that you don't have to, it's basically unlimited. For example, I can just like, because it's just a JSON file, let's say I hated Greenpoint, which is not far from the truth. I could just like remove this part from the JSON file at all. And if I go back to my map, then Greenpoint, which is over here, would not show up on the map, right? So it's a very flexible format, and Metabase works with it really well. And probably you already have all the data because someone who uses maps every day already made it, right? So that's pretty much my favorite thing about maps, because I can put anything I want in there. I don't like neighborhoods. I have like council districts in my data, or I have assembly districts in my data. I can create a map that represents those as well. The important thing to keep in mind, though, here is that, so the GeoJSON files, right, they have this correspondence between the area, the region that you're plotting, and the actual latitude, longitude coordinates. When Metabase is plotting your thing, it is not looking at the latitude, longitude coordinates. Like, it's just looking at the name of the region over here. So, which means that when you're using custom maps, it takes a while to get used to it. When you're using custom maps, you have to put the name of the region into your data. If I didn't have this in my data, I would not be able to make a custom map, even though I had this latitude and longitude in this. Metabase cannot make this correspondence that like these coordinates actually live in this region, so I'm going to put it in this region in a custom map. You actually have to tell it what the region is. But that's the only limitation as far as the data shape is concerned, that you need to put the region name. Like if you want to put it like Canadian provinces, you need to put the actual name of the province on each data point. But as far as putting like just like mapping it, any map you can find on the internet or you can create yourself works. And another thing I want to show you as far as customizations, let me go back to plotting this by pin. So I look at this map and maybe I'll filter it a little bit. It's, well, okay, the pins are there and maybe I want to keep it as pins, but there is also a lot of like additional visual information that I don't need, right? Like this Brooklyn Queens Expressway in red, does it need to be in red? For my map, it's not important. Does it matter that like different streets have different colors? Do I need like every single building here? For my purposes, it's not important, and it actually makes the visualization a lot busier. So another thing that Metabase allows you to do is to change the underlying map tiles. So this is using default OpenStreetMap tiles, and they work really well in kind of zoomed out situations when you're looking at, say, country level or state level. But in cities, it becomes kind of ugly because it represents a lot of information that you might not need. So there are a lot of services that will provide you with different map tiles, so different looks for the underlying map. One that I used is called Map Tiler. There we go. And they have this an assortment of different looks for maps. And one I like to use for data visualization is this called DataViz, right? This look is kind of a little more subdued, doesn't have that many colors, doesn't have that much detail, so that your data visualization would actually pop. So what I can do is go into the admin settings again, maps, and there is another setting here, map tile server URL, and that's what controls the way the underlying map looks. And I'm going to go to this DataViz maps, and we're using raster tiles. So under raster tiles, I'm just going to copy it here. That's why I like using this service, because it just gives me the URL. Other services might need you to like work for this, but it just literally gives me the URL for the tiles. Put this in here. Changes saved, exit admin, and let me go back to my map. Maybe let me just make the map again. I don't need to summarize. Keep trying to summarize. There we go. Now, if we filter this data and like zoom in, you see that the data pops a lot more, and all the unnecessary detail is kind of like detail. It's all gray, white, so you can really concentrate on the data as opposed to the background. All right, so those are the two main customization options that I find not a lot of people use or know about, which is just uploading any custom map you find on the internet and changing the way the map looks. And speaking about changing the way a map looks, I want to talk a little bit about kind of data visualization best practices for maps. I already kind of alluded to this, that this is fine. Like, this is all pretty, looks pretty, but is it useful? Right? What am I trying to say with this chart? Again, Metabase is not a GIS, right? I'm not going to use it to look to identify where is the nearest accessible bike parking for me, right? Metabase is something that I use to look at my metrics summarized by some, filtered and summarized and maybe joined by some rules, right? So what is this, including individual data points, communicating? This is a little too much information for what I need. Like maybe I want to know what are the best neighborhoods for bikes, and really I just need some more information. And I already talked a little bit about this is why you do something like a grid map, or even better, a region map. And you almost never need the pin map, right? If you almost never look at individual data points. If you look at, let's say, let's look at maybe, I don't know, accounts, and I'm going to try to build a bar chart by, say, email and seats. We never build chart like this, right? We would never build a chart that represents it has a single bar for every data point, because that's way too much information to process, and I can only get like a little bit out of it. Well, I can see this big outlier here, but the rest is kind of like requires me to sit down and parse what I have on the chart and try to identify what are the patterns. I'd never build a chart like this, right? If I wanted to look at the distribution of these values, I'd probably build something like count by seats binned, and maybe like I would do 10 bins or something, build a chart like this. This is telling me something. I have a lot of accounts with low seat counts, but I also have these outliers for very high seat counts, right? I never visualize every single data point. But for some reason, a lot of people, when they encounter maps, that are like, just like, I'm going to put all my pins on my map. But why, right? What is it that you're trying to communicate? You're not trying to communicate every single data point. So think about what makes sense as a grouping for you. For example, I told you before that if I were working for the city government, I would probably not care about where each individual bike rack is, but I would care about their distributions, for example, based on the assembly district. That's this column, and that's what I would plot on my chart. So you almost never want to use a pin map. I know they look cool, but it's almost never the best way to represent the data. And we talked a little bit about how we also have grid maps. And grid maps, so when you have binned latitude and longitude, they are good for when you don't have meaningful breakdown of your data. Maybe you just like something maybe like mapping forest fires across the United States. Maybe a grid map is a good option. But when I'm looking at, for example, city level data or state level data, am I really interested in this precise rectangle of latitude and longitude? No, I'm probably interested in something that makes sense for me, for my company, or the organization that I work in, be it like a state or a neighborhood or a borough or a country, right? So I want to include that information into my data and build a region map, be it a custom region map or the one that we have built into Metabase, because that coincides with how people who are going to be seeing this chart think about this data. So almost always the thing that is best to use to represent geographical data is actually a region map. You might you might need to work a little bit for it, like upload a custom JSON file and then change the settings over here. But this map is much more actionable and represents the data that in a way that actually communicates something to me personally. And final thing to think about maps is that, does it matter that they're maps? For example, in this map of bike parking by neighborhood, it's kind of interesting to look at the actual geographical position of the neighborhood, right? I have these desert over here and like nothing on Staten Island. But for example, around Williamsburg, I have a whole cluster of neighborhoods with a lot of bike parking. So here, the geographical information matters. But let's say I have this people table and I summarize them by state. I mean, it looks pretty, but does it matter that it's a map? Does it matter that New Mexico here is next to Texas? The relative geographical position of this data, is it adding something to what you want to communicate? And if not, then don't use a map. Because when I see a map, I assume that the actual geography is important, that the location of Texas on this map has some meaning to what you're trying to communicate to me. And then I'm going to try to parse what that meaning could be. But if not, then just use a bar chart or a row chart. And maybe even better, watch my webinar on row charts and learn that you probably should like order these, maybe even limit the rows to what you're trying to communicate. Like, this is a better chart if what you want to say is we have a lot of people in Texas and like twice as much as in any other place, and Montana is second best. Like, if this is what you're trying to communicate, why is there a map, right? So this is, I think, where I'm going to leave you, because I already spoke for 45 minutes, which is 15 minutes more than I thought. But I collected these tips in a little dashboard that I think Margaret will share to you, is that you probably don't need all the pins. Use summarized maps if you can, be it grid map, if you don't have any kind of meaning to your data, or if you actually have meaning like neighborhoods, states, counties, zip codes, then create a custom region map. And you've seen it, it's very easy. You just Google GeoJSON Canadian provinces and upload it to Metabase. But think about it whether you actually need the geographical dimension, whether the relative position of your regions is actually important. And if not, just remove that dimension from the chart entirely. So that's where I'm going to stop right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yeah, I think we'll start with questions.